Merchant ships approached the harbor of Ugarit after weeks at sea. The crew expected to find the busy docks of the Syrian coast. Instead, they observed thick columns of dark smoke rising from the shoreline. The great stone warehouses and palaces of the city were burning. Bodies floated in the harbor, and the streets were filled with rubble. Ugarit, a center of regional trade for 10 centuries, was destroyed in a single day. This destruction occurred around the year 1177 BC. The ruin of Ugarit was not an isolated event. Within a few decades, nearly every major city in the eastern Mediterranean suffered a similar fate. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia disappeared from the historical record. Its capital was burned, and its administrative system ceased to function. In Greece, the fortified palaces of the Mycenaeans were destroyed and abandoned. Egypt survived the crisis, but its central administration was permanently weakened. The collapse of these societies occurred quickly. The Kassite dynasty in Babylon lost control of its territories. Along the coast of the Levant, major trading hubs were ruined and never rebuilt. Historians describe this event as a systemic collapse. It did not involve one nation conquering another. Rather, the entire network of interconnected civilizations broke down at the same time. Several factors contributed to this sudden decline. Some contemporary records mention seafaring raiders known as the Sea Peoples. Other evidence points to a series of severe earthquakes across the region. At the same time, crop failures led to widespread famine. The complex administrative systems of the palaces could not adapt to these simultaneous crises. To understand how this collapse occurred, it is necessary to examine how these societies functioned. The Late Bronze Age, spanning from 1500 to 1200 BC, was characterized by high levels of international trade. Kingdoms did not exist in isolation. They relied on a complex network of exchange that stretched across thousands of kilometers. The foundation of this global network was the production of bronze. Bronze is an alloy, which means it is a metal made by combining two other metals. The mixture requires 9 parts of copper and 1 part of tin. When combined, these two relatively soft metals create a hard, durable material. This alloy was essential for manufacturing weapons, agricultural tools, and structural fittings. The manufacturing process required precise temperature control. Workers first melted copper in a clay crucible using charcoal fires. The melting point of copper is 1085 degrees Celsius. To reach this temperature, laborers used bellows to pump oxygen into the charcoal. Once the copper was liquid, the workers added tin, which melts at a much lower temperature of 232 degrees Celsius. The mixture was stirred with green wood to remove impurities. Finally, the liquid metal was poured into stone or clay molds to cool. A major challenge for these ancient societies was that copper and tin were rarely found in the same region. Copper was relatively common and was mined in large quantities on the island of Cyprus. Workers extracted the ore from deep shafts using stone hammers and bronze chisels. They smelted the ore near the mines to produce heavy copper ingots. These ingots were shaped like ox hides, with 4 protruding handles that made them easier for 2 men to carry. Each ingot weighed approximately 30 kilograms. Tin, however, was extremely scarce in the eastern Mediterranean. The nearest major sources of tin were located in what is now western Afghanistan, thousands of kilometers to the east. Another source lay in the southern regions of modern-day Britain. To obtain tin, merchants had to organize long overland caravans or complex maritime expeditions. The metal traveled through dozens of intermediaries before reaching the palaces of Egypt or Greece. This reliance on distant resources shaped the structure of Bronze Age kingdoms. Because individual farmers could not source copper and tin on their own, the state controlled the metal trade. Centralized administrations, based in large palaces, managed the economy. These institutions are known today as palace economies. The palace functioned as a fortress, a warehouse, and an administrative center. Scribes recorded every transaction on clay tablets. They used a writing system called Linear B in Greece and cuneiform in Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The scribes kept detailed tallies of agricultural yields, livestock numbers, and metal reserves. Farmers brought their harvests of wheat, barley, olives, and grapes directly to the palace. The administration stored these goods in large ceramic jars called pithoi. These jars stood 2 meters tall and could hold hundreds of liters of olive oil or grain. The palace officials then redistributed these rations to soldiers, craftsmen, and priests. This system allowed rulers to support specialized laborers who did not produce their own food. Metalworkers, shipbuilders, and soldiers relied entirely on the palace for their sustenance. The ruler distributed food rations based on status and occupation. A master metalworker received more grain than a common laborer. This centralized control made the economy highly efficient during times of peace. However, it also made the system vulnerable to disruption. If the palace could not collect grain due to a poor harvest, the entire administrative structure collapsed. The metalworkers could not work, the soldiers could not fight, and the scribes could not keep records. The international trade network operated on similar principles of royal control. Kings did not engage in free trade. Instead, they exchanged luxury goods as royal gifts. A pharaoh in Egypt sent gold to a king in Babylon. In return, the Babylonian ruler sent lapis lazuli and horses. These exchanges established diplomatic alliances and guaranteed the safety of trade routes. Merchant ships traveled along established routes close to the coastline. They moved in a counterclockwise direction around the eastern Mediterranean. A ship would depart from Egypt, carrying grain and linen. It sailed north along the coast of Canaan and Syria, stopping at Ugarit to trade for wood and oil. From there, it traveled west to Cyprus to load copper ingots. The vessel then continued to the Aegean, exchanging goods for Mycenaean pottery and perfumed oils before returning to Egypt. Ramesses II ruled Egypt from his capital in the Nile Delta, directing the construction of temples that displayed his image on a scale never before attempted. Stonecutters at Abu Simbel carved 4 seated figures of the ruler directly into the sandstone cliff, each rising 20 meters high to face the eastern sun. Workers moved thousands of tons of sandstone to clear the interior halls, where columns shaped like the god Osiris supported the roof. The temple served to project Egyptian power toward the southern territories of Nubia, where gold mines provided the metal that funded the monarchy. Gold extraction in the Nubian desert relied on labor gangs working in arid valley beds. Workers crushed quartz veins with stone hand hammers, grinding the ore into dust on flat stone slabs. They washed the powder on inclined stone tables, running water over the silt to separate the heavy gold particles from the lighter quartz sand. The resulting dust was melted in ceramic crucibles using charcoal fires, which operators blew upon with reed pipes tipped with clay nozzles. Once refined, the gold was cast into rings or bars, which officials recorded and transported north to the royal treasuries. Further north, the Hittite state governed Anatolia from the fortified city of Hattusa. The city was enclosed by double stone walls that ran for kilometers across the hilly terrain. scribes in the royal archives recorded diplomatic correspondence on clay tablets using the cuneiform script. To write, a scribe pressed a split reed stylus into damp clay, creating wedge-shaped impressions before baking the tablet in a kiln to make the record permanent. These archives contained the text of the treaty signed with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh, a conflict that ended in a stalemate. The agreement, inscribed on silver tablets that were later copied onto clay, established a defensive alliance and detailed the repatriation of political refugees. In the southern Peloponnese, the Palace of Pylos controlled the regional economy through a centralized bureaucracy. Scribes writing the Linear B script on wet clay recorded the minutiae of palace life, listing the names of bronze workers, the distribution of grain, and the storage of chariot parts. To construct a chariot wheel, a carpenter selected ash wood, heating it with steam to bend the timber into a circular frame. A bronze tire was then secured to the exterior using bronze nails, preventing the wood from splitting on the rocky Greek roads. The palace stored these wheels in dedicated chambers, alongside jars of scented olive oil destined for export. Mesopotamian scholars in Babylon calculated the movements of planets using a base 60 numerical system. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, a method that allowed them to partition space and time with high precision. This mathematics supported detailed astronomical diaries, which scribes kept on clay tablets for centuries, recording eclipses and commodity prices. At the same time, merchants in the coastal city of Ugarit managed the flow of goods between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. These merchants exchanged letters using a simplified alphabetic script of 30 characters, which allowed for faster writing than the complex cuneiform systems of the East. They traded in purple dye, which specialists extracted from the glands of murex snails. Workers collected thousands of snails in stone vats, crushing the shells to extract the tiny vein that contained the dye precursor. They boiled the mixture in lead vessels for 10 days, removing the impurities until the liquid turned a deep red purple. The dyed wool was highly valued across the region, serving as a symbol of royal status. The exchange of these goods was regulated by formal diplomatic protocols. Rulers sent letters to one another, addressing their counterparts as brothers and requesting specific gifts. A Babylonian king wrote to the pharaoh to complain about a shipment of gold that arrived underweight, asserting that the metal was impure. Another letter from the ruler of Cyprus explained that a pestilence had killed the local copper miners, preventing the scheduled export of metal. To transport these materials, merchants used wooden cargo ships built with mortise and tenon joints. Shipwrights cut matching slots into the edges of 2 planks, then inserted a wooden tongue, or tenon, into the slots to lock the planks together. They secured each tenon with a wooden peg driven through the thickness of the plank. This construction created a strong hull that could withstand the waves of the open sea without the need for an internal frame. A ship of this type sank off the southern coast of Anatolia, carrying a diverse cargo of raw materials. The vessel contained 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, cast in the shape of ox hides, with 4 projecting handles for easy carrying. It also carried 1 ton of tin ingots, which metallurgical analysis suggests originated in the mountains of Central Asia. To create bronze, ancient metalworkers had to mix these 2 metals in a precise ratio. Copper melts at a temperature of 1085 degrees Celsius, requiring a draft-heated furnace. Tin melts at the much lower temperature of 232 degrees Celsius. The smith first melted the copper in a clay crucible heated by charcoal, using bellows to pump air into the fire. Once the copper was liquid, the smith added the solid tin, which dissolved quickly into the molten copper. The resulting alloy was poured into stone or clay molds to cast swords, spears, and axes. Pure copper was too soft for weapons, bending easily upon impact with leather or bronze armor. The addition of 10% tin altered the crystal structure of the metal, making the final product hard enough to maintain a sharp cutting edge. However, the lack of local tin sources meant that this entire technology depended on long-distance trade. If warfare or political instability disrupted the trade routes through Mesopotamia, bronze production would stop. The palace economies, which relied on bronze weapons to equip their armies, were vulnerable to any interruption in the supply of these two metals. Every bronze ingot that traveled across the Mediterranean required a reliable supply of copper and tin. This reliance created a vulnerable network. Egyptian military planners relied on tin that originated in the mountain valleys of Badakhshan. The journey of this metal began in what is now Afghanistan. Miners used stone hammers to break cassiterite ore from vein deposits in the rock. The ore was crushed and washed in wooden troughs, separating the heavy oxide from lighter stone. The miners then smelted the concentrate in clay furnaces. They used bellows made of goatskin to push air through clay tubes into the charcoal fire. This process raised the temperature to about 1,000 degrees. At this heat, the tin separated from the oxygen in the ore and gathered as molten metal at the bottom of the hearth. Workers cast the liquid tin into small bars, which merchants loaded onto pack animals. The caravans moved across the Iranian plateau toward the ports of the Levant. At the same time, Cypriot miners produced copper on a scale that dwarfed all other regional sources. They mined chalcopyrite ore from the foothills of the Troodos Mountains. Workers roasted the sulfur-rich ore in open-air pits to drive off the iron and sulfur. They then transferred the roasted material to cylindrical clay smelting furnaces. They added charcoal and silica flux to create a fluid slag. After hours of firing, the heavy copper settled in a pool at the bottom. The smelters tapped the furnace, letting the liquid copper flow into stone molds carved in the shape of ox hides. These molds featured 4 protruding handles, one at each corner. This design allowed 2 men to carry the heavy block easily. The handles also made it simple to lash the ingot securely to a pack saddle or the deck of a ship. A single merchant vessel carried these metals in large quantities. In the 14th century before the Common Era, one such ship foundered off the rocky point of Ulubun. The vessel lay undisturbed until a diver searching for sponges noticed metal shapes on the seabed. The ship was 15 meters long and had a hull built of cedar planks. The builders joined these planks using close-set mortise and tenon joints, securing each tenon with a wooden peg. This method created a strong outer shell before the internal ribs were installed. The cargo hold contained 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots. These ingots were stacked in neat rows, their ox-hide shapes interlocking to prevent shifting in rough weather. Beside the copper lay 1 ton of tin ingots, matching the proportion needed to alloy copper into bronze. The ship acted as a mobile market for the entire region. The excavators recovered blue glass ingots from Phoenicia, cast in circular molds to fit into shipping baskets. The glassmakers colored these ingots with cobalt to mimic lapis lazuli. The cargo also contained jars filled with terebinth resin, used for making perfume and preserving wine. The crew had packed thousands of clay vessels, including Mycenaean stirrup jars designed to hold olive oil. The storage spaces held logs of dark African ebony and pieces of yellow Baltic amber. The amber had traveled overland across Europe, passing through many hands before reaching a Mediterranean port. The crew ate almonds, figs, and pomegranates during the voyage, leaving the seeds in the bilge water. The loss of such a ship represented a significant financial blow to its owners. It also represented a loss of raw materials that could not be easily replaced. A single cargo of 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin could make thousands of bronze swords or spearheads. The bronze alloy was made by melting 9 parts copper with 1 part tin in a clay crucible. The metal workers heated the crucible until the metals fused, then poured the alloy into stone molds. They hammered the cast swords to harden the edges, creating weapons that remained sharp in battle. If the supply of copper or tin stopped, the weapon workshops fell silent. The systems of trade operated without interruption as long as the sea lanes remained open. The dependence on distant resources meant that a disruption at any point could destabilize an entire palace economy. If a drought in Anatolia forced the Hittite king to import grain, he had less bronze to trade for luxury goods. If nomadic raiders blocked the tin caravans in the eastern mountains, the Mycenaean palaces could not equip their charioteers. The specialized economies could not survive in isolation. They had abandoned self-sufficiency in favor of the efficiency of trade. This efficiency made them wealthy, but it also made them fragile. The first signs of collapse appeared along the coasts. Egyptian temple walls recorded the arrival of new groups of warriors. At Medinet Habu, the builders carved reliefs showing large battles against these invaders. The artists depicted the attackers wearing headdresses decorated with feathers or leather strips. The inscriptions called these people the Sea Peoples. The texts listed the kingdoms that had already fallen to their attacks. The invaders destroyed the Hittite capital of Hattusa, burning the palaces and clay tablet archives. They also destroyed Ugarit, a wealthy port city on the Syrian coast. The king of Ugarit wrote a letter to the king of Cyprus, describing how enemy ships had burned his villages and plundered his lands. The letter remained in the city, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace. The names of the raiders appeared in the temple records of Pharaoh Ramesses III. Scribes carved the foreign words into stone at Medinet Habu. The texts identified these groups as the Peleset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Wayshesh. Egyptian administrators recorded these groups with the same precision they used for listing captive populations or foreign tribute. Modern scholars debated the origins of these groups for decades. The Peleset possibly migrated to the southern coast of Canaan, where they became known as the Philistines. The Shekelesh may have originated in Sicily, though the linguistic connection remained weak. Some historians linked the Denyen to the early Greek people, specifically the Mycenaeans, who fled their own burning settlements. Others suggested an Anatolian origin, or a mixed population of displaced people from many different coastal regions. The Egyptian inscriptions presented these events as a series of defensive victories against external invaders. Stone reliefs showed Egyptian archers firing from the shore into crowded enemy ships. The artists depicted the foreign warriors wearing feathered headdresses and carrying round shields. To repel these attacks, the Egyptians used a specific system of shore-based archery and shallow water maneuvers. The Egyptian composite bow was the primary weapon in this defense. The bow construction required horn, wood, and animal sinew glued together in layers. Workers dried these bows for up to a year to ensure the glue cured completely. The resulting weapon could project an arrow with enough force to pierce bronze armor at a distance of 50 meters. Egyptian archers stood on the shore or on the decks of wide-bottomed river barges. These barges lacked the deep drafts of Mediterranean merchant vessels. They could maneuver in the shallow waters of the Nile Delta, where larger ships ran aground. Soldiers used long poles to push the barges through the reeds, while archers fired at the crowded decks of the stranded enemy ships. The invaders used longer, heavier swords designed for close combat, but their ships were vulnerable when trapped in the shallows. Archaeologists found layers of ash and broken pottery in dozens of cities across the eastern Mediterranean. These destructions did not occur during a single season. The ruins of some cities showed evidence of fire, while other settlements appeared to have been abandoned gradually. Families packed their belongings, carried away their metal tools, and left the stone houses to crumble. In some regions, cities rebuilt their walls only to be destroyed again 20 years later. The letters from the city of Ugarit detailed the slow collapse of regional security. King Amurapi of Ugarit wrote to the King of Cyprus, requesting urgent military assistance. The king explained that his own troops were stationed in Anatolia and his ships were patrolling the Lycian coast. This deployment left the home territory undefended when the enemy ships arrived. The scribes in Ugarit pressed these messages into damp clay tablets using a split-reed stylus. The writing system used a 30-character cuneiform alphabet to represent the Ugaritic language. Once written, a scribe placed the wet tablet into a small kiln to bake it into hard terracotta. This process preserved the record even if the building housing it burned down. The ruins of Ugarit showed that the final attack occurred in the early autumn. Excavators found bronze arrowheads embedded in the outer plaster of the palace walls. The location of these arrowheads indicated that the defenders fired from the parapets at attackers in the streets below. The palace treasury was empty, suggesting the rulers either paid a final tribute or fled with the portable wealth of the city. The collapse of trade meant that sailors and shipbuilders could no longer find employment. A standard Mediterranean merchant ship required constant maintenance to remain seaworthy. The hull planks were joined using thousands of individual mortise and tenon joints, each secured with a wooden peg. If a ship remained docked without maintenance, marine boring worms destroyed the softwood hull within 2 seasons. Displaced sailors formed new groups to survive on the sea. They gathered in small fleets and raided coastal granaries to feed their families. These groups did not fight for territory or empire. They sought grain, copper ingots, and bronze tools that they could no longer obtain through peaceful trade. The raids disrupted the farming cycle along the coast, which caused food shortages in the inland cities. The regional economy ceased to function when the exchange of agricultural goods stopped. Rainfall became erratic across the Aegean and the Levant during the decades surrounding the turn of the 12th century before the Common Era. Farmers in central Anatolia, working the dry soils of the Hittite heartland, observed the change in the behavior of their springs. Water levels in the stone basins dropped earlier in the summer. Barley ears remained thin and light, containing fewer grains than the previous generation had harvested. The olive groves on the hillsides of Ugarit produced small, dry fruit that yielded little oil. To understand how these changes occurred, researchers extracted sediment cores from the bottoms of lakes across the eastern Mediterranean. One such core was taken from the Birkat Ram crater lake in the Golan Heights. The extraction process required driving a hollow steel tube deep into the soft mud at the lake bed. Each layer of sediment, deposited year by year as particles settled in the still water, was preserved in sequence. Within these layers, microscopic pollen grains remained intact. Pollen analysis relies on the durable outer shells of the grains, which are made of sporopollenin, a natural polymer resistant to decay. Chemists isolate these grains by treating the sediment samples with hydrofluoric acid to dissolve the mineral components. Under a microscope, the distinctive shapes of the pollen grains reveal the plant species that grew in the surrounding region. The grains of cultivated cereal crops and deciduous oak trees appeared frequently in the layers representing the 13th century before the Common Era. In the layers corresponding to the years after 1200, these numbers drop. The pollen of drought-resistant wild shrubs and chenopods, which thrive in dry, disturbed soils, took their place. Stalagmites in caves across the region recorded the same atmospheric drying in their growth rings. These stone formations grew as rainwater dripped from cave ceilings, depositing dissolved calcium carbonate on the floor. In years of abundant rain, the water dripped rapidly, creating thick layers of calcite. During dry periods, the dripping slowed, resulting in thin, dense bands. The chemical composition of these layers changed depending on the intensity of rainfall. Heavy oxygen isotopes became more concentrated in the calcite when evaporation rates were high, indicating a prolonged lack of moisture. Trees recorded this process in their wood. Dendrochronologists measured the width of annual growth rings in preserved timbers from ancient structures, such as the burial mounds at Gordion. A single tree ring forms when the cambium layer under the bark produces new cells during the spring and summer. The size of these cells depends on the availability of soil moisture. In wet years, the cells grew large and thin-walled, forming a wide, pale band of early wood. In dry years, the growth was restricted, producing a narrow band of dark late wood. The timber samples from the decades around 1200 showed clusters of extremely narrow rings, indicating multiple years of consecutive drought. The palace administrations attempted to manage the grain shortage through their centralized storage systems. A typical Bronze Age palace maintained large underground silos lined with plaster to keep out moisture and rodents. The scribes recorded the intake of grain on clay tablets, tracking the wheat and barley brought in as taxes. When harvests failed, the palace officials distributed these reserves to the population. The first year of drought depleted the surplus grain. During the second year, the palace distributed the seed grain intended for the next planting. By the third year of dry weather, the storage chambers stood empty, and the administrative system could no longer feed the agricultural laborers. The earth beneath the eastern Mediterranean began to move with greater frequency during this period of ecological stress. A series of earthquakes occurred along the major fault lines of the Aegean and the Levant. The boundaries between the African, Arabian, and Eurasian tectonic plates generated constant pressure. This stress was released not in a single massive event, but in a sequence of earthquakes that occurred over several decades. At Mycenae, the limestone walls of the citadel suffered structural damage that differed from the effects of military siege. The large stone blocks, laid without mortar, shifted laterally. The ground movement caused the upper courses of masonry to slide off their bedding joints, falling outward onto the access ramps. The houses built of mud brick on stone foundations inside the walls collapsed inward. The weight of the falling upper stories crushed the storage jars in the ground floor rooms, sealing the domestic goods beneath heaps of yellow clay. The nearby fortress of Tiryns experienced similar destruction. The massive galleries, constructed of corbelled limestone blocks, cracked along the joints with a stone met. The pressure of the shifting earth pushed the walls out of alignment, causing some buildings to collapse entirely. The survivors cleared the debris from the main pathways, but lacked the resources to rebuild the structures on the same scale. The new walls were constructed using smaller, unworked stones held together with mud, replacing the monumental masonry of the earlier period. On the island of Crete, the palace of Knossos showed signs of seismic damage in its lower level. The limestone column bases shifted from their original alignments, tilting the wooden columns that supported the upper floors. The stone gypsum slabs that paved the corridors cracked along their natural bedding planes. The structural failures were accompanied by localized fires caused when open oil lamps fell onto dry wooden beams during the shaking. At Troy, situated near the Dardanelles, the fortification walls of the 6th settlement phase showed evidence of ground movement. The heavy limestone blocks of the outer wall, which sloped inward to resist battering rams, were displaced. Deep vertical cracks opened in the masonry, and sections of the parapet tumbled into the ditch below. The debris from these collapses remained in the streets, where later inhabitants built small, dry stone huts directly on top of the ruins. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, experienced ground movement that preceded its final destruction by fire. The stone walls of the royal palace, which rose several stories high, buckled under the lateral forces of an earthquake. The heavy stone lintels above the doorways cracked in half, dropping into the entrances and blocking access to the inner courtyard. In the residential quarters, the flat roofs, made of clay packed over wooden rafters, collapsed when the supporting walls spread apart. The population of the city had to clear these obstructions from the narrow streets, while simultaneously preparing defenses against maritime raiders. The combination of dry weather and seismic activity weakened the economic connections between the major kingdoms. When a city was damaged by an earthquake, it relied on grain imports from its neighbors to feed the workers who rebuilt the walls. The widespread drought meant that no neighboring state had surplus grain to export. The trade routes became unsafe as communities, unable to grow their own food, turned to coastal raiding to survive. Rainfall declined across the eastern Mediterranean during the 13th century before the Common Era. As the soil dried, the yields of barley and wheat shrank each year. Royal treasuries relied on taxes paid in actual grain, which meant the palace storehouses received less food. The rulers still had to maintain their courts, feed their standing armies, and support the scribes who recorded the inventory. They also had to buy copper and tin from distant merchants to make bronze weapons. When the inflow of grain reduced, the price of food in the markets rose. The poorest laborers in the fields experienced the shortage first. Their children grew slowly, and their bodies became vulnerable to common infections. Famine did not appear as a sudden event, but rather as daily disputes at the distribution points and thefts in the fields. Soldiers who guarded the royal granaries began to resent protecting food for the elite while their own families starved. Royal granaries were constructed to protect large quantities of loose grain from moisture, insects, and thieves. Workers built these structures with thick stone foundations to block burrowing rodents. The walls were made of sun-dried mud bricks, which absorbed the midday heat and kept the interior dry. A layer of plaster made from slaked lime covered the inside walls to seal any cracks. To load the grain, laborers climbed wooden ladders and poured the kernels through high openings near the roof. The grain piled up in a cone, leaving very little airspace at the top. As the grain settled, the remaining oxygen was consumed by the respiration of the seeds, creating an environment rich in carbon dioxide. This lack of oxygen prevented beetles and weevils from multiplying. When grain was needed, a worker opened a small wooden slide at the base of the wall, allowing the dry seeds to flow out into baskets. Earthquakes struck several regions during this period of prolonged dry weather. A city already weakened by hunger suddenly faced the destruction of its physical infrastructure. Storage jars shattered, spilling precious olive oil and wine into the dirt. Temples collapsed, and falling masonry killed citizens in the streets. Rebuilding required large amounts of timber, stone, and labor. The rulers did not have the surplus grain needed to pay the builders. Some communities rebuilt their homes in simpler forms, using mud and rough timber. Other settlements were abandoned entirely, and the survivors walked toward the larger administrative centers. The influx of displaced people strained the remaining food supplies of the surviving cities. The clay tablets recovered from the ruins of Hattusa show the desperation of the Hittite rulers. A king wrote to the pharaoh of Egypt to ask for immediate shipments of grain. The tone of the letter was not the standard language used between equal rulers. The writer pleaded for help because the crops in central Anatolia had failed completely. The Hittite heartland lay on an inland plateau, which made it dependent on seasonal rainfall. Egypt relied on the annual flooding of the Nile, which carried nutrient-rich silt from the African highlands. When the rains failed in the north, the Hittites had to import food by sea. The Hittite king wrote that his people were starving and needed grain to survive. The agricultural system of Egypt depended on the annual rise of the Nile River, a process driven by monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands. Every summer, these heavy rains poured into the Blue Nile, swelling the river as it flowed north. The rising water carried a dark, mineral-rich silt composed of decomposed volcanic rock and organic matter. By August, the river overflowed its banks in Egypt, covering the flat valley floor. Farmers managed this inundation using a network of earthen dikes and canals. They built dirt walls to divide the floodplain into large basins that could hold the muddy water. The water stood in these basins for about 40 days, allowing the suspended silt to settle onto the soil. After the mud settled, farmers drained the remaining water back into the river channel. The deposited silt was damp and soft, allowing farmers to plant seeds without using heavy plows. The kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age operated under a system directed by the palace. The palace functioned as the primary center for manufacturing, storage, and foreign trade. Farmers brought their grain, wool, and sheep to the palace as tax payments. Scribes recorded these transactions on damp clay tablets using pointed reeds. The palace distributed these goods as rations to the craftsmen who made textiles, pottery, and weapons. Merchants sailed on ships owned by the king, exchanging local oil for foreign metals. While the system worked, it provided food security for the population. However, this high level of centralization made the entire economy vulnerable to minor disruptions. If one part of the network failed, the entire system collapsed. The administrative offices of Mycenae and Pylos recorded unequal divisions of land, livestock, and labor. High officials and aristocrats received large portions of land, multiple slaves, and generous grain allocations. These elites hunted with trained dogs, held banquets with imported wine, and ordered decorated pottery and perfumed oils. The palace administration financed religious festivals and chariot parades. Palace storehouses held gold drinking cups, bronze daggers inlaid with gold and silver figures, and dyed textiles from distant ports. Outside the palace walls, peasant families worked the land and tended the flocks. Scribes recorded these farming families as numbers on clay tablets. The lists detailed the number of men, women, and children assigned to specific fields or sheepfolds. Palace officials demanded heavy taxes in the form of wool, grain, oil, and bronze scrap. The state also required corvée labor, which was a system of unpaid compulsory work on royal projects. Under the corvée system, local governors summoned farmers during the agricultural off-season. A peasant had to travel to designated sites to build stone roads or repair fortification walls. The palace also sent these laborers to harvest royal fields. The mechanics of building a Mycenaean roadway required clearing a path, laying down a foundation of large, unworked stones, and packing the gaps with smaller gravel and clay. Peasants carried these heavy stones by hand or moved them with simple wooden levers. When dry weather reduced crop yields, the palace tax collectors did not reduce their demands. During wet years, the population accepted these burdens because the palace stored grain for emergencies and hired guards to deter raiders. The king performed rituals to appease the gods and maintain order. As dry years persisted and earthquakes damaged the storehouses, this social contract began to break. Palace administrations responded by increasing control over the remaining resources. Clay tablets from the final years of the palace at Pylos reveal an administration preparing for an emergency. Scribes wrote lists of coastal watchers stationed along the shores of western Greece. Other tablets recorded lists of rowers, chariots, and weapons. Scribes wrote these tablets on wet clay, and the records dried when the palace burned down. The heat of the fire baked the clay, preserving the writing for excavation. The tablets do not name the enemy, but the writing shows an administration attempting to manage a sudden crisis. In Egypt, Pharaoh Ramesses III claimed to have distributed grain to the hungry and prevented the poor from robbing one another. The necessity of such a statement suggests that civil order was failing. In Ugarit, letters described bandits operating in the countryside and blocking the trade roads. Hittite records from this period show that vassal rulers failed to send tribute to the king. Highly centralized governments reacted to these shortages by demanding more resources from their subjects. They raised taxes, demanded more labor, and ignored local traditions. A Hittite farmer faced shrinking harvests year after year, while tax collectors demanded the same quantity of grain. The palace moved this grain along royal roads to feed the capital city, while local granaries remained empty. To store grain safely, palace architects constructed deep, dry underground silos. These silos were lined with thick plaster to keep out moisture and burrowing insects. The top of the silo was sealed with clay seals that bore the stamp of the royal storekeeper. Only authorized officials could break these seals to distribute the grain. Seeing these guarded silos while their own families starved caused many farmers to abandon their land. Archaeology shows that while large fortified sites were burned or abandoned, smaller villages in the hills survived. Some destruction layers show no signs of a siege, such as bronze arrowheads or breached walls. Instead, the fires burned only the administrative quarters where the tax tablets were kept. This indicates that local populations may have rebelled against the tax collectors. Townsfolk and farmers destroyed the archives to erase the records of their debts. The collapse of the palace economy was accelerated by a withdrawal of consent. Farmers refused to support a system that could no longer protect them from famine or raids. When drought, earthquakes, and raids occurred at the same time, the social structure failed. Without belief in the king's authority, the palace became a target for plundering. The end of the palace system stopped the import of luxury goods. Lapis lazuli from Badakhshan, cedar wood from Lebanon, and tin from Central Asia disappeared from the Aegean. Monumental stone architecture stopped, and writing systems like Linear B fell out of use. However, the farmers no longer had to give up a large portion of their harvest. Without corvée labor, families spent more time on their own fields. Local trade continued on a smaller scale, using barter instead of palace distribution networks. Archaeologists refer to this period as a Dark Age because the large palaces and written records disappeared. In the soil of these centuries, archaeologists still find simple houses, plowed fields, and local pottery. Hittite kings ruled from a high plateau where the winds swept across central Anatolia. This landscape shaped a kingdom that the scribes of Egypt recognized as one of the 4 great powers of the earth. Royal letters from the Nile Delta addressed the ruler in Hattusa as a brother. These rulers exchanged daughters in marriage to seal alliances, sending them with caravans of gold, textiles, and draft animals. A messenger carrying a royal letter did not travel light or unguarded. The letters themselves were written on clay tablets, which were enclosed in clay envelopes to prevent tampering. To read the message, the recipient had to break this outer shell. The writing was cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped signs pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. Scribes in Hattusa had to master not only their own language, but also Akkadian, the international language of diplomacy. The clay had to be kept at the correct moisture level while the scribe worked. If it dried too quickly, the stylus would tear the surface. If it remained too wet, the wedge shapes would slump and become illegible. Once the text was complete, the tablet was dried in the sun or baked in a kiln to make the record permanent. Hattusa was protected by stone walls that followed the natural ridges of the hills. The builders of these fortifications did not use mortar to hold the stones together. Instead, they relied on a technique known as Cyclopean masonry, where massive limestone blocks were shaped to fit against one another with precision. Laborers cut these stones from nearby quarries using bronze chisels and wooden wedges. To split a block, workers carved a line of holes into the stone, hammered dry wooden wedges into the slots, and poured water over them. The wood expanded as it absorbed the water, exerting enough pressure to split the limestone along the desired line. Once moved to the wall site on wooden rollers, each stone was trimmed so its faces matched the angles of its neighbors, creating a barrier that resisted both battering rams and earthquakes. Behind these walls, Hittite smiths worked with a rare and difficult material. Long before iron became the common metal for tools, these artisans developed methods to smelt iron ore. The process required much higher temperatures than those needed for copper or tin. Smiths built clay furnaces filled with charcoal and used leather bellows to pump air through clay pipes into the fire. This continuous blast of oxygen raised the temperature until the iron ore reduced to a spongy mass of iron mixed with slag, known as a bloom. The smith then reheated this bloom and hammered it repeatedly to squeeze out the impurities. This process of hot forging aligned the grain of the metal, producing a tough, forgeable iron that was initially reserved for ceremonial daggers and royal seals. Despite these technologies, the Hittite state faced internal strain. Succession disputes weakened the authority of the throne, forcing kings to demand new oaths of loyalty from their vassals. Letters sent to Syria grew urgent as tribute payments arrived late. The plateau of Anatolia suffered from dry years, making the capital dependent on grain shipped from coastal vassals. In the north, the Kaska peoples, who lived in the rugged mountains near the Black Sea, continued to raid the outlying fields and settlements. The northern border of the Hittite realm had long been vulnerable to the Kaska tribes. These people inhabited the rugged forests and steep valleys near the Black Sea, a terrain that prevented the effective deployment of Hittite chariot forces. The Kaska fought by launching sudden raids on lowland farms, carrying off grain and livestock before retreating into the mountains. In the final decades of the empire, records of these incursions became more frequent. The Kaska exploited every internal dispute and succession crisis within the Hittite royal family. This pressure coincided with dry years that depleted the grain reserves stored in the capital city of Hattusa. To understand how these grain reserves were maintained, one must look at the physical construction of Hittite underground silos. Rather than building tower-like granaries, Hittite engineers dug vast subterranean chambers into the clay soil of Hattusa. The largest of these complexes measured dozens of meters in length. Workers lined the earthen walls of these trenches with thick layers of straw and packed clay to prevent moisture from seeping in. Once the grain was poured into the chamber, it was sealed from above with a heavy cap of soil and plaster. This seal excluded oxygen, which prevented the growth of mold and suffocated any grain weevils that might have been brought in with the harvest. A properly sealed underground silo could preserve wheat and barley in edible condition for decades. However, once the seal was broken to feed the population during a drought, the grain had to be consumed quickly before humidity ruined the remainder. As the silos emptied, the administrative correspondence of the capital grew more urgent. The last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, sent a letter to the king of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. The clay tablet carrying this message was later found in a ruined building. Suppiluliuma II complained that foreign ships were attacking his coastal territories. He demanded that Ugarit dispatch all its available ships and soldiers to defend the Hittite homeland. This request placed a severe strain on Ugarit, which was itself experiencing shortages and threats from maritime raiders. The letter was never answered. Shortly after its arrival, Ugarit fell to invaders who burned the city to the ground. The intense heat of the destruction fire baked the clay tablets stored in the royal archives, preserving them for modern excavators. Among the ruins, the letter from Suppiluliuma II lay where a scribe had left it on the floor. Hattusa met a similar fate around the year 1180 BC. Archaeological excavations reveal a thick layer of charcoal and ash covering the palace and temple districts. The great stone temples were pulled down, and the wooden beams that supported their upper stories burned until they collapsed into the cellars. No conqueror left an inscription boasting of the city's destruction. The imperial administration simply ceased to exist, and the road networks connecting the provinces fell into disrepair. While small farming villages in the valleys continued to cultivate their crops, the central state vanished from the historical record. In the centuries following the collapse, several small principalities emerged in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. These states, including Carchemish, Malatya, and Kumu, preserved elements of the old imperial culture. Their rulers commissioned stone reliefs showing storm gods standing on the backs of bulls, a motif directly inherited from Hittite art. They also used a hieroglyphic script to write Luwian, a language closely related to the official tongue of Hattusa. These kingdoms relied on stone masonry techniques that mirrored the defense works of the Old Empire. To build their city gates, they employed the orthostat technique. Workers quarried large, flat slabs of basalt or limestone. They dressed the front faces of these stones with bronze chisels and mallets, leaving the back rough. The builders then set these slabs upright on edge along the lower course of a mud brick wall. This stone facing protected the vulnerable base of the wall from water erosion and the battering rams of enemies. The upper sections of the gatehouses were built of sun-dried mud bricks, reinforced with wooden tie beams. These small states maintained their independence for several generations at the margins of the expanding Assyrian Empire. They acted as a cultural bridge, keeping Hittite religious names and artistic styles alive long after the capital at Hattusa had been forgotten. Eventually, the Assyrians absorbed these principalities into their provincial system, and the last traces of the Hittite political tradition disappeared from the region. While Anatolia collapsed, the Egyptian state prepared to defend its territory. The Egyptians possessed a long historical memory of periods when central authority had broken down. They recalled the times when local nomarchs ruled independent districts and the Nile Valley was divided among competing dynasties. When the crisis of the early 12th century BC arrived, Egypt was ruled by Ramses III of the 20th dynasty. Ramses III took the throne at a time when regional trade routes were failing. he ordered the construction of defensive works along the eastern frontier of the Nile Delta. His inscriptions described a migrating coalition of northern peoples who had traveled south by land and sea. The Egyptians did not use the term sea peoples. Instead, they listed individual groups, such as the Peleset, the Checker, and the Denyen. These groups traveled with their families, carrying their household goods in heavy ox carts. The migration moved through the Levant, destroying cities along the coast before approaching the Egyptian border. Ramesses III mobilized the Egyptian army, which consisted of native conscripts, foreign mercenaries, and chariot divisions. The first major battle took place on land along the northeastern boundary of Egypt. The details of this clash were recorded on the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu. The reliefs depict the Egyptian infantry attacking the foreign warriors. The invaders wore feathered headdresses or horned helmets and carried round shields. The Egyptian archers used composite bows to shoot bronze-tipped arrows into the advancing ranks. The reliefs also show the wooden ox carts of the migrants, loaded with woven baskets and children, caught in the middle of the fighting. Egyptian chariots charged the flanks of the migrating column, breaking their formation and scattering the draft animals. Ramesses III claimed to have destroyed the land force, capturing thousands of prisoners who were subsequently branded and settled in military colonies. Egyptian scribes recorded the details of the second phase of the invasion on the walls of Medinet Habu, depicting a battle fought entirely upon the water. The reliefs show high-prowed Egyptian vessels crashing directly into the ships of the Northern Coalition. Archers stood on the wooden decks of the Egyptian ships, drawing composite bows to rain arrows down upon the crowded enemy decks. The foreign warriors fell into the shallow water of the river branches, losing their round shields and long bronze swords. To achieve this victory, the Egyptian commanders lured the foreign fleet into the narrow channels of the Nile Delta. In these shallow waters, the heavy, square-rigged ships of the invaders could not turn or maneuver. The Egyptians deployed archers along both banks of the river, trapping the enemy vessels in a crossfire. A composite bow of this period was constructed from layers of wood, animal horn, and sinew, glued together with animal hide glue and cured for up to a year. This construction allowed the bow to store immense energy, launching arrows with enough force to penetrate leather armor at a distance of over 100 meters. The archers fired systematically into the packed vessels until the enemy crews were decimated. Those invaders who survived the arrows and the capsizing of their ships were captured by Egyptian soldiers waiting on the muddy banks. Ramesses III claimed to have settled these captives in military colonies within Egypt, using them as mercenary troops. The cost of defending the delta exhausted the royal treasury. At the same time, the annual flood levels of the Nile became erratic, reducing the agricultural yield of the basin system. The loss of territories in Canaan and Syria stopped the flow of bronze, silver, and dyed textiles that had previously funded the court. Inside the mud-brick palace walls at Thebes, the authority of the pharaoh began to erode. In the 20th year of the reign of Ramesses III, a secondary wife named Ti initiated a plot to assassinate the king. She intended to place her son, Pentuer, on the throne instead of the designated heir. Scribes, guards, and physicians joined the conspiracy, using written messages to coordinate their actions. They employed wax figures and written spells which they believed would weaken the physical defenses of the king. A wax figure of this type was shaped by hand to resemble the victim. The magician then incised the victim's name into the soft wax using a bronze stylus. According to Egyptian ritual practice, the figure was then bound with red thread, spat upon, and melted in a small clay brazier. The conspirators believed this physical destruction of the image would cause corresponding physical harm to the pharaoh. The plot was discovered before the coronation of Pentuer could take place, and the conspirators were arrested. The trial records were written on papyrus sheets using black and red ink. Scribes manufactured this writing material by peeling the pith of the papyrus sedge into thin strips. These strips were laid side by side in two perpendicular layers, moistened with muddy water from the Nile, and pressed together under heavy stones. After drying in the sun, the surface was polished smooth with a shell or a piece of ivory. The resulting sheets were glued end to end to form long scrolls. The judicial papyrus lists the names of the conspirators, their confessions under torture, and their sentences. Several high-ranking officials were condemned to carry out their own executions by drinking poison. For many years, the mummy of Ramesses III showed no obvious signs of violence. Modern computed tomography scans of the embalmed body revealed a deep incision across the throat of the pharaoh. The cut severed the trachea, esophagus, and major blood vessels down to the cervical vertebrae. The embalmers had placed a small Eye of Horus amulet inside the wound during the mummification process to heal the injury in the afterlife. The death of the king did not cause the immediate collapse of the Egyptian state, but the administration grew weaker under his successors. The later pharaohs retained the name of Ramesses, yet their authority did not extend beyond the Nile Valley. The garrisons in the Sinai were withdrawn, and the trade routes to the east were abandoned. In the village of Deir el-Medina, located on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, the state employed highly skilled artisans to construct the royal tombs. These workers lived in stone houses surrounded by a walled compound, completely dependent on the central government for their food and water. They received monthly rations of barley and emmer wheat from the royal granaries, which were delivered by local administrative scribes. During the reign of Ramesses I, these grain deliveries began to arrive late. The scribes blamed the delays on the empty state treasuries in Thebes. The workers laid down their bronze chisels and marched across the hills to the mortuary temples of the valley. They sat down outside the temple gates, refusing to work until their rations were suspended. This action represents the first recorded labor strike in history. The local priests negotiated with the workers, distributing small amounts of pastry and beer to convince them to return to the tombs. The strikes repeated throughout the dry season as the grain supplies remained inconsistent. The breakdown of the distribution system led to widespread tomb robbery in the Valley of the Kings. Bands of thieves broke through the sealed stone doors of the ancient tombs to steal the gold and silver grave goods. These thieves often operated with the assistance of local officials who provided information about the layout of the tombs. To access the treasure chambers, the robbers used copper chisels and wooden mallets to quarry through the limestone bedrock. Once inside, they used bronze knives to pry the gold foil from the wooden coffins and furniture. They melted the stolen metal in small clay crucibles using charcoal fires to remove the royal seals and identifying marks. The melted gold was then traded in the local markets for grain, oil, and livestock. The judicial records of the late New Kingdom contain the transcripts of the trials of these robbers. The state officials beat the suspects on the soles of their feet with wooden rods to extract confessions. The suspects described how they climbed into the tombs at night, broke open the wooden sarcophagi, and stripped the gold amulets from the linen wrappings of the mummies. The state executed the ringleaders by impalement on wooden stakes. Egypt survived this period of civil disorder because of its geographic isolation. The eastern and western deserts prevented large-scale foreign invasions from launching land attacks against the Nile Valley. The The agricultural system of the valley depended on the predictable annual rise of the river rather than the seasonal rains that watered the Hittite plateau. Even during years of low inundation, the narrow strip of silt along the riverbanks remained fertile enough to support the local population. The Egyptian administration relied on a centralized system that could mobilize labor and resources even during periods of extreme stress. Unlike the kingdoms of the northern Mediterranean, the pharaonic court controlled a vast network of grain storehouses and scribal departments. These departments could track taxes, reallocate food supplies, and assemble military forces from regional garrisons. When external pressures increased, this bureaucratic machine remained operational. The state retained the capacity to build defensive walls, provision naval vessels, and maintain communication between the Delta and Upper Egypt. This survival came at the expense of Egypt's international influence. Over the decades following the reign of Ramses III, the central authority in Thebes and Pi-Ramses weakened. Egyptian garrisons withdrew from the southern outposts in Nubia and the eastern garrisons in Canaan. Without these territories, the incoming tribute of gold, copper, and foreign timber ceased to flow into the royal treasuries. By the middle of the 11th century BC, the administrative unity of the country dissolved into two distinct regions. In the northern delta, local rulers established a capital at Tanis, managing the trade routes that reached into the Mediterranean. To the south, the high priests of Amun at Thebes exercised political control over Upper Egypt, operating independently of the northern court. This political division made it difficult to coordinate large-scale agricultural works along the entire length of the river. Libyan chieftains moved into the western delta, establishing local lordships that eventually laid claim to the pharaonic titles. Nubian kings later advanced from the south, taking control of Thebes and presenting themselves as defenders of the traditional temples. The division of the country affected how the population maintained the irrigation systems. In earlier centuries, the state oversaw the clearing of the primary canals that diverted water from the Nile into the fields. The canal clearance process required hundreds of laborers working with wooden mattocks and wicker baskets. A worker used a heavy L-shaped wooden mattock to loosen the dry mud from the canal bed. The loose silt was then shoveled into woven baskets made of split palm fronds. These baskets were carried up the steep embankments on the shoulders of laborers and dumped onto the dikes to reinforce them. Without central oversight, individual villages had to maintain these channels themselves. This localized effort often led to disputes over water rights between neighboring communities during dry seasons. Far to the east of the Mediterranean coast, the Kassite dynasty of Babylon experienced a similar decline. For 4 centuries, the Kassite rulers had maintained a stable administration over the plains of southern Mesopotamia. They did not engage in the aggressive expansionism of the contemporary Hittite Empire. Instead, they focused on the repair of the ancient canal systems and the preservation of traditional administrative records. This stability allowed for regular diplomatic exchanges with Egypt and Assyria, involving the trade of horses, lapis lazuli, and royal brides. During the late 13th century BC, this equilibrium began to fail. From the Iranian plateau to the east, Elamite armies advanced into the Mesopotamian lowlands, targeting the major cities along the Tigris and Euphrates. The Assyrians pressed down from the north, seeking to secure their southern borders and control the trade routes. The Kassite administration collapsed under this dual pressure, and the capital city of Babylon was plundered. The Elamite forces carried the cult statue of Marduk, the patron deity of the city, back to their capital at Susa. This loss of the cult statue disrupted the religious and political life of the city. In Mesopotamian kingship, the presence of the divine statue was necessary for the performance of the New Year festival. This festival confirmed the king's right to rule for the coming year. The ritual began with the king entering the inner sanctuary of the temple, where he surrendered his scepter, ring, and mace to the high priest. The priest then struck the king across the face and pulled him by the ears to force him to kneel before the deity. The king had to declare that he had not neglected the city or its temples during his rule. Only after this declaration did the priest return the royal insignia. Without the physical statue of the god in the temple, this ritual could not be completed, undermining the legitimacy of successive rulers. While southern Mesopotamia struggled with fragmentation, the Assyrians to the north managed to preserve their administrative core. The kingdom contracted, abandoning its western outposts along the Euphrates and focusing its resources on the homeland around Ashur and Nineveh. The Assyrian administrative structure relied on a system of provincial governors who reported directly to the king. These governors were responsible for collecting grain taxes and maintaining the local military garrison. The writing system of Assyria remained intact throughout this period of contraction. Scribes continued to write administrative documents and royal inscriptions on clay tablets using cuneiform script. A scribe prepared a tablet by shaping wet clay into a flat, rectangular cushion. Using a stylus cut from a reed, the scribe pressed the wedge-shaped end into the damp clay to form characters. The stylus had a triangular cross-section, allowing the writer to make different marks by varying the angle of the stroke. Once the text was complete, the tablet was left to dry in the sun. This process turned the clay into a durable record that could survive in palace archives for centuries. Further east, beyond the Zagros Mountains, the cities of the Indus Valley had already undergone a process of transition. The large urban centers of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, which had featured gridded streets and elaborate brick drainage networks, had declined centuries earlier. The reasons for this decline involved shifts in the monsoon patterns that sustained the river systems. As the rains grew lighter, the rivers that fed the agricultural fields dried up or changed their courses, leaving the cities isolated from their water sources. This did not result in the sudden disappearance of the population. Instead, the urban residents relocated to smaller settlements in the eastern and southern parts of the region. The grand brick houses were replaced by simpler structures built of mud and timber. The standardized system of stone weights used for trade across the Indus region fell out of use. Craft production, such as the manufacture of beads and pottery, became localized, with each valley developing its own distinct style. The region became a patchwork of small farming communities and nomadic groups. These groups brought new language patterns and social structures that would eventually form the basis of early historic India. Far away in the valley of the Yellow River, a different dynastic transition occurred while the Mediterranean world was struggling with its own crises. The Shang dynasty had ruled this northern plain for several centuries from their capital cities. Their scribes recorded questions to ancestors on the flat underbellies of turtle shells and the shoulder blades of oxen. A diviner prepared these bones by drilling shallow pits into one side. The diviner then applied a glowing bronze poker to the pit. The sudden heat caused the bone to crack with a sharp sound. Scribes interpreted the shape of these cracks to predict royal births, military campaigns, and the success of the millet harvests. They carved the results directly into the bone using a small bronze stylus. The Shang rulers also commissioned bronze vessels for ritual banquets. Craftsmen cast these vessels using complex piece mold casting, a method that required workshops to coordinate several steps. First, the artisan sculpted a clay model of the desired vessel, such as a heavy, three-legged food cauldron. Once this model dried, the artisan pressed wet clay against it to form outer mold sections. These sections were removed in pieces, carved with intricate patterns of mythical beasts, and baked. The artisan then scraped down the original inner model to create a smaller core. When the outer mold pieces were assembled around this core, they left a thin gap. Workers poured molten bronze, an alloy of copper, tin, and lead, into this narrow space. Once the metal cooled, the outer clay molds were broken away to reveal the finished vessel. Around the year 1046 BC, a coalition of western provinces led by the Zhou dynasty launched a military campaign against the Shang capital. The Zhou forces defeated the Shang army at the Battle of Muye. To justify their rebellion, the Zhou rulers formulated the concept of the Mandate of Heaven. This political theory asserted that heaven bestowed the right to rule on a just leader. If a ruler became corrupt or ignored the welfare of the people, heaven withdrew its mandate. The transition did not cause a systemic collapse of northern Chinese society. The Zhou adopted many Shang administrative methods, but they altered the style of burial goods. They buried their dead with sets of bronze vessels that emphasized political rank rather than the ecstatic ancestral communication of the Shang. This change did not directly relate to the fall of Ugarit or the burning of Hattusa. Scribes in Anatolia did not write about the Yellow River. No Chinese diviners asked their ancestors about the Aegean Islands. The regions operated as separate systems, but both experienced transitions during the same broad period. In the Aegean Basin, the destruction of the palaces led to a period of reduced material complexity. The administrative script known as Linear B disappeared entirely when the palaces burned. Scribes had used this script by incising signs into damp clay tablets with a pointed bone stylus. These tablets were dried in the sun to keep records of wool deliveries, bronze allocations, and palace personnel. Because the tablets were not baked in kilns, they were meant to be recycled by wetting the clay again. The fires that destroyed the palaces accidentally baked these tablets, preserving the writing for modern recovery. When the palaces collapsed, the scribes found no new employment, and the art of writing was lost for approximately 4 centuries. Without central administrators, the construction of monumental masonry stopped. The massive walls of Mycenae and Tiryns have been built using limestone blocks that weighed several metric tons. Laborers dragged these stones from local quarries using wooden rollers and thick hemp ropes. They fitted the rough blocks together without mortar, filling the gaps with smaller stones and clay. This technique required a coordinated workforce that only a palace administration could feed and direct. When the palaces ceased to function, local populations abandoned the fortresses. They moved to smaller settlements on high hillsides or built simple houses of mud brick and timber on the plains. Long-distance exchange networks also contracted. During the height of the Bronze Age, merchant ships followed the counterclockwise currents of the eastern Mediterranean. These ships carried copper ingots shaped like ox hides from Cyprus, jars of wine from the Levant, and fine painted pottery from the Peloponnese. A standard ship could carry several metric tons of cargo. The crew navigated by staying within sight of the coastline during the day and anchoring in sheltered bays at night. When the palace economies collapsed, the demand for these luxury goods fell. Local potters continued to make vessels, but they used local clay and simpler decoration. The Aegean became more isolated, and the memory of the Bronze Age palaces survived only in oral poetry. North of the Alps, communities developed new methods for working iron. Bronze required copper and tin, which were rarely found in the same region. Tin had to be transported across long distances from mines in Western Europe or Central Asia. Iron ore was far more common, but it required a different technology to extract the metal. Smelters built small clay furnaces called bloomery furnaces to process the ore. They filled the furnace chamber with alternating layers of charcoal and crushed iron oxide ore. To start the smelting process, workers pumped leather bellows to force air through a clay tube near the base of the furnace. This raised the temperature inside to approximately 1200 degrees. At this temperature, the iron did not melt completely. Instead, the chemical reaction reduced the ore to a spongy mass of metallic iron mixed with glassy slag. The smelter broke open the clay furnace to extract this hot mass, called a bloom. He then hammered the bloom repeatedly on a stone anvil to squeeze out the liquid slag. This process of heating and hammering had to be repeated dozens of times to create workable wrought iron. This technology allowed local communities to make tools without relying on long-distance trade. In Central Europe, this period coincided with the spread of the Urnfield culture. These people cremated their dead and placed the ashes in ceramic urns, which they buried in large cemeteries. They did not build stone palaces or keep written records. They did, however, produce bronze swords, iron knives, and decorative pins with detailed geometric patterns. The historian Eric Klein proposed that the collapse of late Bronze Age civilizations did not result from a single catastrophic event. No individual nation or specific group of invaders destroyed the ancient kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean in a single year. Instead, the failure of these societies occurred because multiple destructive forces happened to strike at the same time. The kingdoms belonged to an interconnected system where a disturbance in one region triggered failures in another. This process resembles the way modern engineers analyze the structural failure of electrical grids or bridges. When one support beam or power line fails, the remaining parts must carry the extra weight. If they cannot bear the load, the entire structure falls down. During the 13th century before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean contained several powerful states. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, Cyprus, Assyria, and Canaan formed a network of trading partners. Each kingdom sent its local resources to its neighbors in exchange for goods it lacked. Merchants carried copper from Cyprus and tin from Central Asia to make bronze tools. Scribes recorded shipments of grain, timber, horses, and ivory on clay tablets. Royal families sealed these economic connections by marrying their children to foreign princes and princesses. These marriages created obligations that bound the rulers together in times of peace. In a stable system, these connections protect individual kingdoms from localized disasters. If a dry summer ruined the barley harvest in one valley, a neighboring king could ship surplus grain to prevent starvation. This assistance was not free. The receiving king paid for the food with silver or specialized manufactured goods. However, this mutual dependence made the entire region vulnerable to widespread shocks. When multiple kingdoms faced crises simultaneously, they could no longer help each other. The networks that previously distributed resources began to transmit instability instead. If Cyprus could not mine copper, Mycenaean bronze smiths could not produce weapons. Without weapons, the Greek rulers could not protect their trade routes. The failure of one node in the network damaged every other node. To understand the environmental pressures of this period, scientists analyze physical clues preserved in the earth. They extract long vertical cylinders of mud from the bottoms of lakes and seas, a process called sediment coring. A hollow metal pipe is driven deep into the underwater silt to retrieve these samples. Inside the layers of mud, researchers find ancient pollen grains that fell from trees and grasses thousands of years ago. Pollen grains have tough outer shells made of sporopollenin, a natural plastic-like substance that resists decay. By examining these grains under a microscope, scientists can identify the specific plants that grew in each era. A sudden decrease in oak tree pollen and an increase in wild grass pollen indicates that the climate became dry. This method reveals that a severe drought lasted for several decades across the Aegean. Further evidence of climate change comes from the chemical composition of ancient human skeletons and cave stalagmites. Scientists measure the ratio of oxygen isotopes preserved in the teeth of people who died during the collapse. The ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in dental enamel reflects the composition of the drinking water available during a person's childhood. In dry periods, lighter oxygen isotopes evaporate faster from open water sources, leaving behind higher concentrations of the heavier isotope. Stalagmites in limestone caves grow as mineral-rich water drips from the ceiling. Each thin layer of stone preserves a record of the rainfall during the year it formed. These records show that the Late Bronze Age drought was the most severe dry spell in several centuries. During this period of agricultural failure, tectonic activity along the active fault lines of the Aegean increased. Earthquakes struck cities that had stood for generations. The violent movements of the earth collapsed stone fortifications and crushed houses. In many palaces, the heavy wooden beams supporting the roofs caught fire when oil lamps spilled during the tremors. Rulers who were already struggling to feed their populations had to divert resources to clear rubble and rebuild walls. The physical destruction of administrative centers disrupted the collection of taxes and the distribution of food. Citizens began to lose confidence in the ability of their kings to maintain order and secure the favor of the gods. As resources grew scarce, displaced populations began to move across the region in search of food. These groups did not travel as peaceful merchants carrying letters of introduction. Instead, they moved as armed migrants, seeking land to settle or food to seize. Some of these groups became the Sea Peoples who raided the coasts of Egypt and the Levant. At the same time, local farmers and laborers faced heavy taxation from palaces trying to maintain their lifestyles. Many peasants simply walked away from their fields to seek safety in the hills. The loss of agricultural labor reduced food production even further. Soldiers went unpaid because the royal treasuries ran out of grain and silver. The breakdown of trade routes had a direct physical impact on the production of bronze. Bronze is an alloy that requires 9 parts of copper mixed with 1 part of tin. Copper was abundant on Cyprus, but tin had to travel thousands of kilometers from mines in modern Afghanistan. To smelt bronze, workers heated copper in a clay crucible until it melted at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. They then added the tin, which melted at a much lower temperature, and stirred the mixture with green wood branches. The resulting liquid was poured into stone molds to cast axe heads, swords, and chisels. When maritime raiders disrupted shipping lanes, the supply of tin stopped. Without tin, smiths could only recycle old bronze tools, which gradually degraded in quality and strength. The lack of metals and grain caused the administrative machinery of the palaces to fail. Scribes could no longer be fed from royal stores, so they stopped recording transactions on clay tablets. The specialized craftsmen who worked in palace workshops left to find food in the countryside. Rulers attempted to assert control by demanding larger shares of the harvest from the surviving villages. This extraction caused local rebellions and further weakened the authority of the kings. The kingdom of Ugarit sent desperate messages to the Hittite king, pleading for troops and ships to defend its shores. The Hittites, however, were facing their own food shortages and could not spare any forces. Ugarit was burned, and its ruins were never rebuilt. Not all modern historians agree that this collapse was a sudden and simultaneous catastrophe. Some scholars argue that dating the collapse to a single year like 1177 before the Common Era oversimplifies a long process. They point out that different regions entered crisis at different times over a span of more than a century. Some cities survived and even prospered, while neighboring regions burned. This perspective describes the end of the Bronze Age as a slow decline rather than a sudden fall. In this view, people adapted to changing conditions over several generations by moving, changing their crops, and finding new ways to trade. The transition was a series of local adjustments to difficult circumstances. During these centuries of social disruption, a new technology began to spread through the region. Metalworkers started to produce tools and weapons from iron instead of bronze. Iron was not a new discovery, as people had worked small amounts of it for centuries. They had fashioned knives and ceremonial objects from iron found in fallen meteorites. They had also extracted tiny amounts of iron from rare copper ores during the smelting process. However, these early iron objects were difficult to make and remained luxury items reserved for kings. The collapse of the bronze trade forced smiths to develop better ways to extract iron from common local ores. Local blacksmiths learned to heat iron ore with charcoal in small clay furnaces called bloomeries. The process required continuous pumping of bellows to push air through a tuere, raising the temperature to about 1,200 degrees Celsius. Unlike bronze casting, this heat did not melt the iron. Instead, it reduced the ore to a spongy mass of iron mixed with silicate slag, known as a bloom. The smith then lifted this red-hot mass from the furnace with iron tongs and placed it on a stone anvil. By striking the bloom repeatedly with a heavy stone or bronze hammer, the smith squeezed out the liquid slag. This process of heating and hammering was repeated dozens of times to produce workable wrought iron. As these techniques spread, local communities relied less on the long-distance trade networks that had once supplied copper and tin. Ancient administrative documents disappeared when the palaces burned. Scribes wrote temporary records, like tax receipts and grain deliveries, on unbaked clay tablets. These tablets dried in the sun and were meant to be recycled by dampening the clay. Only when a palace caught fire did these clay documents bake into hard ceramic tiles, preserving them for excavation. Papyrus documents and wooden writing boards, which held the permanent archives of many kingdoms, burned to ash. Archaeologists discovered that some cities were never rebuilt, while others survived as ruins where squatters lived. In many regions, the population did not vanish, but scattered into smaller settlements. Families built small stone houses on high, steep ridges that were easy to defend against raiders. These farmers cultivated small terraces and kept sheep, operating without the oversight of palace tax collectors. Along the narrow coastal strip of the northern Levant, several harbor towns survived the collapse. The towns of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos possessed natural harbors sheltered by offshore reefs. Shipwrights in these ports constructed merchant vessels from timber cut in the nearby Lebanon mountains. They selected tall, straight trunks of the Mediterranean cypress and the cedar of Lebanon, which grew on the high slopes. To build a ship, carpenters first laid a heavy keel of oak along the shore. They attached the stem post and stern post to the ends of this keel using mortise and tenon joints. The hull was built by fitting thick planks together, edge to edge. Carpenters cut small rectangular slots or mortises into the edges of the planks every few centimeters. They inserted small wooden pegs or tenons into these slots to link the planks together. To secure the joints, they drilled holes through the tenons and drove wooden pegs called trunnels through them. Once the hull planks were assembled, the shipwrights fitted internal ribs to strengthen the frame. They sealed the seams with pitch extracted from pine resin to keep the vessel watertight. These vessels relied on a single square sail made of heavy linen, reinforced with leather strips at the corners. The sailors navigated by keeping the coastline in sight during the day and watching the stars at night. They watched the movement of the Ursa Minor constellation, which they called the Phoenician Star, to maintain a northward or southward course when out of sight of land. They also monitored the flight of birds released from the deck to find the nearest shore. Without competition from the defunct royal fleets of Ugarit and Mycenae, these coastal merchants expanded their trade routes. They carried jars of olive oil, rolls of Egyptian papyrus, and logs of cedar wood to Cyprus. In return, they collected copper ingots from the island. They transported these goods to Greece, where local elites purchased them to display their wealth. As trade grew, the merchants established permanent settlements along their routes to restock their ships. They chose offshore islands or easily defensible peninsulas with freshwater springs. One of these stations, on the northern coast of Africa, grew into a large city. The new settlement on the coast of North Africa was called Carthage. Phoenician colonists from the city of Tyre established this trading post on a prominent peninsula. The site offered 2 natural harbors, which the settlers eventually expanded by digging out deep basins. They connected these basins to the sea through a narrow channel that could be closed with chains. The inner harbor was circular, designed to house war galleys, with a central island for the admiral's headquarters. The outer harbor served merchant ships, which unloaded timber, purple-dyed cloth, and silver onto stone quays. To build these quays, workers used a hydraulic concrete mixture. They combined volcanic ash, lime, and water, pouring the slurry into wooden cofferdams secured in the shallow water. Once the mixture hardened, it formed a durable stone foundation that resisted the action of salt water. Over generations, the settlement grew into an independent state. The Carthaginians constructed massive stone walls across the isthmus to protect their territory from the local Libyan tribes. The Phoenicians also carried a writing system that differed from the scripts of the Bronze Age. The older systems, such as Egyptian hieroglyphs, required scribes to memorize hundreds of distinct signs. These signs represented either complete words or specific combinations of consonants and syllables. Scribes trained for years to master the brush strokes and clay carving techniques. The Phoenician system reduced writing to 22 signs, representing only consonant sounds. To record a transaction, a merchant scratched these letters into clay or ink on pottery fragments. The writer did not record vowels, leaving the reader to supply them based on the context of the sentence. This simplified system spread rapidly along the sea routes. Greek merchants encountered the script in trading ports like Almina on the Syrian coast. They adopted the signs but modified several characters to represent vowel sounds, which were essential for their language. A Greek scribe used a pointed stylus made of bone or iron to scratch these letters onto wax-coated wooden tablets. The tablets consisted of 2 wooden leaves joined by leather thongs. The scribes smoothed the wax with the flat end of the stylus to erase mistakes. Eventually, Etruscan traders in central Italy learned this Greek script and adapted it for their own language. The Romans later modified the Etruscan alphabet to write Latin, which became the ancestor of modern European scripts. In the highlands of Canaan, small agricultural communities began to form in the hill country. These villages consisted of clusters of 3-room or 4-room houses built of unhewn stone and mud brick. The residents terraced the steep hillsides to prevent soil erosion during the winter rains. They dug cisterns into the limestone bedrock, lining the interiors with waterproof plaster. To make this plaster, workers burned limestone in kilns to produce quicklime, then mixed it with sand and water. They applied the mixture in thick layers to the cistern walls, sealing the porous rock to store rainwater through the dry summer months. The animal bones discarded in these villages contained very few pig remains, unlike the lowland Canaanite sites. Archaeologists trace the emergence of the Israelites through these distinctive settlement patterns and utilitarian pottery. On the southern coastal plain, another group established a network of 5 major cities. These cities were Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. The material culture of these settlements differed from the surrounding Canaanite towns. The inhabitants built large hearths in the center of their main halls, a design common in the Aegean. They cooked food in clay ovens that resembled those found in Greece. They also produced pottery decorated with black and red geometric designs, using a clay slip that fired to a smooth finish. Egyptian records referred to these coastal settlers as the Peleset, a group that modern historians associate with the Philistines. The rivalries between the hill country Israelites and the coastal Philistines over agricultural land and grazing rights persisted for generations. Across the Aegean, the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces led to a period of isolation. The population of the Greek peninsula declined, and many survivors moved to small villages in defensible hill areas. Without the palace bureaucracies, the knowledge of Linear B writing disappeared entirely. For several centuries, these communities did not use written records. Instead, oral poets preserved historical memories through long narrative songs. These singers relied on a system of formulaic phrases and strict poetic meters to memorize thousands of verses. They performed at feasts, reciting stories of bronze-clad warriors and distant expeditions. By the 8th century before the Common Era, trade with the Eastern Mediterranean resumed. Greek communities adopted the Phoenician alphabet and began to establish a new political organization called the polis. The polis was a self-governing city-state consisting of an urban center and its surrounding agricultural territory. Unlike the old Bronze Age kingdoms, the polis was not ruled from a central palace. Citizens gathered in an open assembly area called the agora to debate laws and vote on public policy. To smelt the iron needed for tools and weapons, blacksmiths developed the bloomery process. A bloomery was a small chimney built of clay and stone, about 1 meter high. The smith charged the furnace from the top, alternating layers of charcoal and iron ore. They used leather bellows to force air through a clay pipe near the bottom of the furnace. This raised the temperature to about 1200 degrees Celsius. This temperature was not hot enough to melt the iron, but it reduced the ore to a spongy mass of iron mixed with liquid slag. The smith then used iron tongs to pull this red-hot sponge, called a bloom, out of the furnace. They placed the bloom on a stone anvil and struck it repeatedly with a heavy hammer to squeeze out the molten slag. By reheating and hammering the iron multiple times, the smith forged a dense bar of wrought iron. This metal was tougher than bronze and did not require imported tin. Assyrian administrators in northern Mesopotamia began organizing their society around permanent military preparation. The Assyrian state relied on a standing army equipped with iron weapons, which required a systematic method of production. Blacksmiths heated iron ore with charcoal in small clay furnaces called bloomeries, using bellows to pump oxygen through clay pipes called tuyères. The process separated the iron from the stony silicate slag, leaving a spongy mass of metal called a bloom. Workers hammered this hot bloom repeatedly on stone anvils to squeeze out the remaining liquid slag, producing a dense, malleable iron. This iron was then shaped into spearheads, arrowheads, and long swords that held a sharp edge. The state distributed these weapons to soldiers who were organized into regular units of infantry, cavalry, and charioteers. Royal scribes recorded the distribution of weapons on clay tablets, tracking inventory across provincial garrisons. This administrative system allowed Assyria to mobilize large forces quickly and maintain control over its territory. In the Levant, small kingdoms established territorial boundaries and built fortified towns on hilltops. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah constructed stone storehouses and plaster-lined cisterns to manage water resources in the dry highlands. To build a cistern, workers dug a deep pit into the limestone bedrock, shaping it like a bottle with a narrow neck. They coated the porous rock walls with multiple layers of lime plaster, which they made by burning limestone in kilns and mixing it with sand and water. This plaster sealed the rock, preventing rainwater from seeping away during the dry summer months. Channels cut into the surrounding stone directed winter runoff into the cistern opening. These plaster-lined cisterns allowed small communities to survive in areas far from natural springs. The inhabitants farmed terraced hillsides, growing olives, grapes, and wheat on narrow strips of soil held back by stone retaining walls. Greek communities reorganized their defense around the hoplite soldier, a citizen who purchased his own armor and weapons. The primary weapon was a long wooden spear tipped with iron, accompanied by a circular shield called an aspis. Craftsmen constructed the shield by carving a shallow wooden bowl, usually about 1 meter in diameter, from light wood like poplar or willow. They covered the outer surface with a thin sheet of bronze to deflect blows and lined the interior with leather. The shield featured a central bronze band, the porpax, through which the soldier slipped his forearm, and a leather handle, the antilabe, at the edge for his hand. This double grip system allowed the soldier to carry a heavy shield without tiring his wrist. In battle, soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in a tight formation called a phalanx, where each man's shield protected the right side of the neighbor to his left. The cohesion of the formation depended on mutual support rather than individual combat. The collapse of the palace administrations removed the central control over trade, writing, and agricultural surplus. Palace scribes had recorded transactions on clay tablets using complex writing systems like Linear B, which only a small group of specialists could read. When the palaces burned, the need for these specialized administrative records disappeared, and the knowledge of the script was lost. In the absence of royal monopolies, local merchants began using a simpler alphabetic script borrowed from Phoenician traders. This alphabet used fewer than 30 signs, each representing a single consonant sound, making it far easier to learn than older logosyllabic systems. Merchants scratched these letters onto clay jars to mark ownership, contents, or destination. The ease of learning this script allowed literacy to spread beyond a small scribal elite to ordinary traders, artisans, and farmers. The dry climate of the transition period forced farmers to adapt their agricultural techniques to survive long droughts. In the Aegean and the Levant, farmers shifted from large-scale monoculture controlled by palaces to diversified subsistence farming. They planted mixed crops of barley, lentils, and chickpeas, which matured at different times and had varying resistance to dry weather. Barley possessed a deeper root system than wheat, allowing it to draw moisture from deeper soil layers during dry winters. Farmers also kept small herds of goats and sheep, which could graze on scrub vegetation that cattle could not digest. The animals provided milk, wool, and dung, which farmers mixed into the soil of their small plots to restore nutrients. This mixed farming strategy reduced the risk of complete crop failure and allowed small households to remain self-sufficient. Coastal communities built small, versatile merchant ships that did not require royal financing to construct or maintain. Shipwrights assembled these vessels using a mortise and tenon technique, joining planks edge to edge over a minimal internal frame. They cut rectangular slots, or mortises, into the edges of two adjacent oak planks. They then inserted a tight-fitting wooden peg, the tenon, into the slots and secured it with wooden dowels driven through the planks. This method created a strong, watertight hull that could withstand the choppy waters of the Mediterranean. These ships carried mixed cargoes of copper ingots, olive oil, wine, and pottery between small coastal settlements. Because the vessels were small, they could beach on sandy shores, eliminating the need for expensive harbor infrastructure. This dangerously trade network linked regional markets and facilitated the exchange of new technologies and ideas across the sea. A merchant vessel cut through the dark waters of the eastern Mediterranean, its crew steering toward the harbor of Ugarit. The ship carried a heavy cargo of Cretan wine, copper ingots from Cyprus, and jars of purple dye. For weeks, the sailors had navigated by the stars and the shape of the coastlines. Now, as the Syrian shore appeared on the horizon, they saw columns of black smoke rising into the sky. This was not the light haze of cooking fires or temple altars. As the vessel neared the docks, the crew found the harbor choked with charred timber and floating debris. The city of Ugarit, a trading hub for over 1,000 years, had been destroyed. Its palace was burning, its temples were heaps of rubble, and the streets were filled with the dead. This destruction occurred around 1170 BC. It was not an isolated event. Within a few decades, nearly every major state in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia for generations, vanished so completely that its history was forgotten for 3 millennia. In Greece, the stone palaces of the Mycenaean kings were burned and abandoned. Egypt survived the crisis, but the new kingdom was shattered, losing its hold on foreign territories. The Kassite dynasty in Babylon fell, and the wealthy trading cities along the Levantine coast were ruined. Within a single lifetime, the regional network of the Late Bronze Age fell apart. Historians refer to this transition as a systemic collapse. No single invader or disaster was responsible for the breakdown. Instead, multiple pressures occurred at the same time. Scholars point to the Sea Peoples, who were maritime raiders of uncertain origin. They also cite evidence of prolonged droughts, crop failures, earthquakes, and internal rebellions. The palace economies had grown too rigid to adapt to these challenges. When several crises hit the network at once, the connections that made the civilizations powerful also made them vulnerable. To understand this collapse, it is necessary to examine the system that preceded it. The period from 1500 to 1200 BC was characterized by trade and diplomacy. Civilizations spanning thousands of kilometers were linked by commercial routes and royal treaties. In Egypt, the new kingdom reached its peak under Ramesses II, who ruled for more than 6 decades. He commissioned temples at Abu Simbel and Thebes using Nubian gold to fund his projects. Egypt controlled the southern Levant and possessed grain reserves that could feed large populations. To the north, the Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia from its fortified capital, Hattusa. The city was protected by stone walls and contained archives of clay tablets. These documents recorded military campaigns, laws, and treaties. The Hittites fought the Egyptians to a stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh, which involved thousands of chariots. Afterward, the two empires negotiated a peace treaty. The text was recorded in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, establishing a formal alliance between the rival powers. Meanwhile, Mycenaean Greece was ruled by warrior kings from palaces like Mycenae and Pylos. These centers were administrative hubs where scribes used the Linear B script to record economic assets. The tablets document inventories of chariot wheels, bronze armor, and perfumed oil. Mycenaean trade networks stretched from the Italian peninsula to the ports of the Near East. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians and Babylonians maintained libraries, legal systems, and mathematical methods. Along the Levantine coast, cities like Ugarit and Byblos served as points of exchange for goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe. These states communicated through a shared diplomatic protocol. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, preserved the correspondence between the pharaohs and other rulers. The kings addressed one another as brothers, exchanged gifts of gold and lapis lazuli, and negotiated political marriages. One letter from a Babylonian king complained about a delayed shipment of Egyptian gold. Another from the ruler of Cyprus apologized for a shortage of copper exports, blaming a local plague outbreak. These documents reveal a network of statesmen managing international relationships. The trade networks of the Late Bronze Age required the movement of raw materials over vast distances. Bronze is an alloy created by combining copper and tin. This mixture was the essential technology of the era, used to produce weapons, tools, and agricultural implements. Copper was relatively abundant in the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus possessed large mines, as did Anatolia and the Sinai Peninsula. Tin, however, was rare. The primary sources of tin were located in Fasting and Central Asia, thousands of kilometers from the Mediterranean coast. To create bronze, metallurgists mixed approximately 9 parts copper with 1 part tin. The process required a reliable supply of both metals. A typical bloomery furnace used charcoal to heat the copper ore until it melted. The tin was then added to the liquid copper, creating a harder metal that could hold a sharp edge. Because no single kingdom possessed local access to both ingredients, trade was a strategic necessity. A disruption in the supply of Afghan tin would prevent Mycenaean smiths or Egyptian armorers from producing weapons. The extent of this trade is illustrated by the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the southern coast of Turkey. The vessel sank around 1300 BC while carrying a cargo of diverse origins. Archaeologists recovered 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots cast in the shape of ox hides with corner handles. The ship also carried a ton of tin, glass ingots from Mesopotamia, Canaanite jewelry, Baltic amber, and Mycenaean pottery. This cargo represented a cross-section of the Mediterranean economy, carried on a single wooden vessel. The reliance on these long-distance networks created a vulnerability known as tight coupling. In this type of system, a failure in one node can cause a reaction throughout the entire network. Cyprus could specialize in copper extraction because its rulers knew they could import grain from Egypt and tin from the east. When the trade routes were open, this specialization was efficient. However, if a war or natural disaster closed a port, the supply chain broke down. Kingdoms could not easily find alternative sources for essential materials, leading to economic instability. The Uluburun ship was about 15 meters long, constructed using the mortise and tenon method. This technique involved carving slots into the edges of wooden planks and inserting rectangular oak pegs to hold them together. The hull was then reinforced with internal ribs. Such vessels navigated by keeping the coast in sight, steering with large oars mounted on the stern. A series of shipwrecks caused by storms or piracy could deplete the metal reserves of a palace economy. When these losses occurred alongside disruptions in overland routes, the impact escalated. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III describe an invasion by groups they called the Sea Peoples. Inscriptions on the walls of the temple at Medinet Habu state that these groups destroyed lands across Anatolia and the Levant before attacking Egypt. The texts list several tribes, including the Peleset, Jeker, and Denyen. Scholars have attempted to identify these groups, suggesting the Peleset were the Philistines and the Denyen were related to the Mycenaean Greeks. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict battles on both land and sea. The foreign warriors are shown wearing feathered headdresses or horned helmets, carrying round shields and straight swords. In the land battle scenes, the invaders travel with ox carts carrying women, children, and household goods. This detail suggests the movement was not merely a military campaign, but a migration of displaced populations. These families may have been fleeing famine or war in their home regions, looking for new lands to settle. Scholars debate whether the Sea Peoples were the cause of the Bronze Age collapse or a symptom of it. The traditional narrative presents them as invaders who destroyed the established kingdoms. More recent research suggests they were refugees from systems that had already begun to fail. As palaces burned in Greece and Anatolia, former soldiers, sailors, and peasants joined together to seek resources. These bands turned to piracy and coastal raids because the collapse of their home economies left them with few alternatives. The last letters from Ugarit show the escalation of this crisis. The king of Ugarit wrote to the ruler of Cyprus, reporting that enemy vessels had burned local villages and damaged the fields. He explained that his own troops and ships were away in Anatolia, assisting the Hittites. The letters indicate that Ugarit was already weakened by food shortages and internal strain before the final attack. The city was burned around 1190 BC, and its administrative archives were buried under the collapsing walls of the palace. The Sea Peoples were eventually stopped at the borders of Egypt. Ramesses III deployed archers along the banks of the Nile Delta to fire upon the enemy's ships. The Egyptian navy trapped the invaders in shallow channels, capsizing their vessels and capturing the survivors. While Egypt defended its territory, the cost of the war drained the royal treasury. The pharaoh could no longer maintain control over the Levantine provinces, and the new kingdom began to decline. Archaeological and scientific evidence suggests that environmental changes preceded the military conflicts. Researchers have analyzed pollen grains extracted from sediment cores at the bottom of lakes in Greece, Cyprus, and the Levant. The data reveal a sharp decline in agricultural pollen and oak tree pollen around 1200 BC. At the same time, pollen from drought-resistant wild shrubs increased, indicating a long-term dry period. This climate shift is supported by studies of stalagmites in caves. Stalagmites grow as water drips from the cave ceiling, depositing layers of calcite. The thickness and chemical composition of these layers reflect the amount of rainfall over time. The records from this period show a decrease in precipitation that lasted for several decades. Tree rings from archaeological timbers in Anatolia also show patterns of narrow growth rings, which occur during consecutive years of drought. This drought affected the agricultural output of the palace economies. The Hittites, whose territory was inland, were particularly vulnerable. Without sufficient rain, the grain fields of central Anatolia failed to produce enough wheat and barley. The palace at Hattusa had to import grain from Egypt and coastal Syria. A letter from a Hittite king to the ruler of Ugarit states that there is famine in his land and requests immediate shipments of food. In addition to drought, the region experienced a series of earthquakes. Geologists refer to this phenomenon as an earthquake storm. Along the active fault lines of the eastern Mediterranean, a major earthquake in one section can trigger subsequent tremors in adjacent areas over a period of decades. Archaeological excavations at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Troy reveal collapsed stone walls and buckled floors dating to the late 13th century BC. These damages suggest seismic activity rather than military destruction. When a palace was damaged by an earthquake, the rulers had to redirect resources to rebuild the fortifications and storehouses. If this occurred during a drought, the economy faced double pressure. The king had to feed the builders and stonecutters from dwindling grain reserves. In some cases, the damage was too severe to repair. The population abandoned the ruined citadels and relocated to smaller, unfortified settlements in the hills. The palace economy of the Late Bronze Age was built on central control. In Mycenaean Greece and the Hittite Empire, the palace collected agricultural produce, wool, and metals from the surrounding countryside. Scribes recorded these goods on clay tablets, tracking tax payments and labor obligations. The palace then redistributed rations of grain, oil, and beer to the craftsmen, soldiers, and priests who worked for the state. This system concentrated wealth and decision-making in a single location. The elite lived within the fortified citadels, using imported luxury goods to demonstrate their status. The Linear B tablets from Pylos record allocations of perfumed bronze, gold vessels, and specialized workers. For the peasant population, the system required constant labor. Farmers had to hand over a portion of their harvest and participate in public works, such as building roads or clearing canals. When environmental conditions deteriorated, the palace had to increase its demands on the population. Scribes insisted on full tax quotas even when harvests were poor. In the final years of Pylos, the tablets show lists of coastal watchers and emergency collections of bronze from local temples. The administration was attempting to prepare for security threats while managing shortages. The pressure on the peasantry grew, leading to social tension and internal unrest. In some cases, the destruction of the palaces may have been the result of domestic revolts. The common people, facing starvation, turned against the administrative centers. Some destruction layers show fires concentrated in the storehouses and archives rather than the defensive wall. This pattern suggests internal looting rather than a foreign siege. By burning the clay tablets that recorded their debts and tax obligations, the rebels erased the evidence of their subjection to the palace. Following the collapse of the central administrations, the survivors adapted to simpler lifestyles. Without the palace to collect taxes and distribute food, local communities became self-sufficient. They grew their own grain, kept small herds, and produced simple pottery. The complex bureaucracy of the Bronze Age was no longer needed, and the art of writing disappeared from Greece for centuries. The end of the palaces was a disaster for the kings and scribes, but it may have offered relief to the rural population. The collapse of the Bronze Age empires left a fragmented landscape. In the Levant, the retreat of Egyptian power allowed new communities to develop. Among these were the Phoenicians, who inhabited a series of coastal cities in modern Lebanon. Towns like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos had survived the destructions. With the old trade monopolies gone, Phoenician merchants began to build their own maritime networks, sailing west towards Cyprus, Sicily, and North Africa. The Phoenicians developed an alphabetic script to facilitate their trade transactions. Unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphs, which required hundreds of signs, this system used 22 letters to represent consonant sounds. It was simple to learn and could be adapted to different languages. Greek merchants adopted the Phoenician alphabet, adding vowels to create the basis for the modern Western script. This writing system spread along the Mediterranean trade routes, replacing the lost palatial scripts. In the highlands of Canaan, small agricultural villages emerged. These communities constructed terrace farms on the hillsides and built plaster cisterns to store rainwater. The material culture of these settlements suggests a population focused on subsistence farming rather than imperial trade. These highlanders eventually organized into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, developing their own cultural and religious identity in the space left by the collapse of the Egyptian Empire. Along the southern Levantine coast, the Philistines established a confederation of 5 cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Archaeological excavations in these cities have revealed pottery styles and hearth designs that resemble those of Mycenaean Greece. This evidence suggests that some of the displaced populations from the Aegean settled in the Levant, blending with the local Canaanite cultures. The interactions between these coastal cities and the highland communities shaped the history of the Iron Age. In Greece, the period following the collapse is known as the Greek Dark Ages. For several centuries, the region lacked stone palaces, monumental art, and written records. However, this was also a period of technological transition. Greek metalworkers began to smelt iron, which was more abundant than the copper and tin needed for bronze. Iron weapons and tools became common, allowing local communities to farm and defend themselves without relying on international trade networks. By the 8th century BC, these communities began to coalesce into the independent city-states of the Classical era. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age demonstrated the limits of complex, centralized systems. The networks of the late 2nd millennium BC were highly efficient, but fragile. When climate change, natural disasters, and migration disrupted the trade routes, the empires could not sustain themselves. The collapse was destructive, but it also allowed new technologies, writing systems, and social structures to emerge from the ruins of the old world. These innovations laid the foundation for the civilizations that followed.